A millionaire sat in the center of a luxurious restaurant, an arrogant smile on his lips. A young waitress quietly approached holding a tray of water, her eyes cast downward. Minutes later, that very girl silenced the entire room and shattered everyone's hearts. Sounds like a scene from a movie you've seen somewhere. But this isn't a film. This is a true story. A story about an ordinary person like me, like you, who chose not to stay silent in the face of contempt. And she used music to turn a moment of humiliation into a collective awakening. Emily, 25 years old, worked as a server at an upscale French restaurant named La Fontaine, located in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. She wasn't the kind of person you'd notice when you walked in. Not someone who drew attention or craved the spotlight. She was gentle, attentive, always smiling at guests and left each table as if she'd never been there. But there was one thing no one knew: Emily was a pianist. No, she didn't study at Juilliard. There were no honorary diplomas on her wall. She learned to play on an old piano gifted by a neighbor. She trained her fingers not with famous teachers, but with the summer heat, the noise of kids playing outside, and sleep traded for practice after every shift. Music was the one thing Emily never let go of. Even when everything else in her life had to be set aside, scholarships, music schools, big stages, the piano remained. Silent, just like her. She once dreamed of stage lights and applause after a performance. But then reality hit. Her mother fell ill. Tuition debt rose and her younger sister needed help. She closed the piano lid, put on an apron, went to work every day like any other adult with one thing no one could see: a fire inside her that never went out. Have you ever carried a dream, one that only lived during lunch breaks, train rides, or just before you fell asleep at your desk? Have you ever thought, maybe my dream isn't big enough? Maybe I'm not good enough? If you've ever felt that way, Emily's story is for you. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one act of courage, and the world goes quiet to hear the voice within you. Stay with me, because you're about to witness what a waitress with no microphone, no fame did, with nothing but her hands, a piano, and a heart that wouldn't quit. And that changed everything. If you've ever walked into a fine dining restaurant during peak hours, you might have seen them. Servers moving nonstop, trays full in hand, eyes scanning every table. And chances are you wouldn't remember a single face among them, because they all looked the same: polite, busy, nearly invisible. Emily was like that. She wore the simple black uniform, hair neatly tied, a courteous smile on her face. At first glance, there was nothing about Emily that stood out. But if you paid attention, how she brushed her hand across the table to smooth the cloth, or how she paused slightly when jazz music played from the corner, you'd notice something. Something unspoken. Emily wasn't born into luxury, nor was her path to the arts paved for her. She grew up in a small southern town where people believed that being a nurse or accountant was the only stable route. But even as a child, Emily was captivated by the sound of a piano. She didn't learn to play in the traditional way. Her first piano was an old upright with dark wood, gifted by a neighbor who was moving away. It was worn off key, often in need of repair. But to Emily, it was treasure. She taught herself songs by ear, starting with simple melodies from the radio, then slowly deciphering faded sheet music she found at thrift stores. She had no teacher, but she had time, patience, and an unshakable love for music. Each night after school, while her peers watched movies or texted, Emily sat at the piano, her hands gliding over the keys, like she was telling a story only she understood. Time passed. Emily grew up. Real life came knocking. Her mother got sick. Her sister needed help with tuition. The dream of performing on stage slowly became impractical. She applied to music schools but couldn't get enough scholarship money, and so she folded that dream away like an old letter. She got a job. She became a waitress. And each time she started a shift at La Fontaine, where a grand piano sat silently in the corner, she reminded herself just getting by is good enough. But there was one thing: she didn't give up practice. She still played on that old piano in her small apartment. Early mornings before work, or late nights after the city had gone to sleep, she'd sit and play just for herself. No audience, no expectations, just her, the music, and the feeling of being real. There's something strange about passion. It doesn't disappear even when you neglect it. It waits for you to come back. Emily never called herself an artist. She didn't post videos online or brag about accomplishments. But music was still her second breath, what got her through exhausting shifts, bad days, and the self-doubt that crept in. Sometimes the greatest talents don't stand on stages. They stand behind bars, clear tables, live quietly, but shine all the same. And it was that quietness that made Emily the perfect target for a cruel little game one particular evening. An evening when a man walked into the restaurant carrying an ego bigger than the luxurious space he sat in. A man who never imagined that the girl pouring water in front of him could make him feel small. La Fontaine wasn't your typical restaurant. It wasn't just a place to eat dinner. It was a stage where crystal glasses sparkled under chandeliers, where tablecloths were ironed to perfection, and jazz played like a soundtrack from an old film. It catered to politicians, wealthy entrepreneurs, local celebrities, people for whom each dish wasn't just a meal, but a statement of status. Every steak sliced to the exact millimeter, every wine paired by vintage, every server's step timed and angled just right. Emily called it another world, not because it was luxurious, but because it was completely cut off from real life. In the kitchen, hot and chaotic, the chef yelled over sizzling oil. In the dining room, guests sat in velvet chairs, laughing softly like time didn't exist. Emily moved between those two worlds like a silent messenger, from kitchen to table, from sweat to French perfume, from frantic commands to distant, "Thank you, darling S." At La Fontaine, every server understood. You're not just carrying food, you're upholding a luxury experience. There's no room for mistakes, no room for personal feelings. One night a couple came in. They ordered the most complicated dish on the menu, changed the ingredients 3 times, and sent back dessert because the strawberries weren't angled right. Emily apologized, gently smiled, and took the plate back to the kitchen. To outsiders, it might seem like submission, but to Emily, it was a performance, a role she chose to play, not out of fear, but because she understood some dreams grow only with patience. And sometimes patience is the highest form of art. That was La Fontaine, dazzling, yet demanding, glamorous, yet humbling. A place that could make someone feel powerful, but also make others forget who they were. But Emily never forgot. Every time she passed the grand piano in the corner, rarely touched, she'd glance at it. As a silent reminder, I'm still here. I'm still me. Then one night, when the sparkling lights no longer felt warm, but became the unwanted spotlight, when people no longer saw her as a server, but as a source of amusement, Emily stepped out of the role, not with words, but with music. The glass doors of La Fontaine opened with a soft chime, a familiar sound that usually went unnoticed. But this time, every head in the room turned almost in unison, a reflex. Victor had arrived. His Italian wool coat fit perfectly across his broad shoulders, a gleaming watch catching the light, and a presence that suggested this place had been built for him. Not because Victor was a celebrity in the papers or on TV, but because he carried himself like someone important. And more than anything, he believed it. Victor was the kind of man you remember forever, not because he was kind, but because he made himself unforgettable. Every word he said seemed designed to test the listener's limits, sharp, mocking, but coded in just enough charm to make resistance feel like overreacting. He didn't come to La Fontaine to eat. He came to be seen eating. Emily had seen people like that before, but none as overt as Victor. While many wealthy customers masked their arrogance with politeness, Victor didn't bother. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to dominate the space. And more than anything, he wanted to control the mood around him. As Emily approached his table to take the order, he looked at her like examining a curious piece of decor. Emily, he read slowly off her name tag, his smile thin. I imagine a name like that must carry something special, doesn't it? The words weren't overtly offensive. But anyone who's ever dealt with someone like Victor knows it's not about what's said, but how it's said. It was a game, a test, a soft kind of provocation, just enough to unsettle but not enough to break the rules. Victor didn't become that way by accident. Maybe he learned to control rooms, early boardroom stages, or just a family that only listened when he raised his voice. Men like Victor weren't just rich. They were used to winning. And to him, Emily was just part of the scenery, a backdrop to make his evening more interesting. Someone to play his favorite game on push prod, watch them squirm. But Victor didn't know something. Emily wasn't easy to shake. She didn't answer with a sharp retort, nor did she shy away with fearful eyes. She just remained silent. a silence strong enough to catch his attention. A silence not born of weakness, but of the quiet confidence of someone who knows her worth and doesn't need to prove it with words. And as usual, that very silence made men like Victor crave control even more. He started his game with finesse, false compliments, leading questions, and finally a humiliating suggestion disguised as playful fun. But this time the game wouldn't go as planned. There's something odd about people like Victor. They don't like silence, especially the kind they can't manipulate. When Emily didn't react as expected, didn't hesitate or fawn, but simply smiled and continued her work, that composure unnerved him. Unfamiliar with being ignored, Victor grew curious. And his kind of curiosity wasn't about understanding. It was about manipulation. The meal continued amidst lively chatter from Victor's table. He told stories of success investments and people who only dream but never act, the last line said loud enough for Emily to hear. Each time she passed by, he tossed out a teasing remark, a veiled comment. "You're not planning to wait tables forever, are you? With hands like those, I'd think you'd be doing something more artistic." His words were wrapped in charm, but the intention was clear. He was testing her. And Emily knew it. Provocation, even dressed in friendly words, is still provocation. There's a painful truth many in service jobs like Emily's know too well. Silence isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's survival, because not everyone has the power to respond to disrespect without risking their job. Emily had stayed silent many times before. When someone doubted her dream, when she had to give up music school, when old friends succeeded while she scraped by. And now as Victor smiled, but cut into her dignity with a blade hidden in a handshake. But what made Victor different that night wasn't just that he disrespected her. It was that he wanted everyone to see it. When dessert was served, Victor leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping his wine glass, voice rising as if setting the stage. "Emily," he said, "I hear you play piano quite well." She paused slightly, turned toward him, polite as always. "Oh, it's just a hobby," she replied, voice quiet but steady. Victor smiled. "A hobby? That sounds modest. Why not give us a little taste?" He glanced toward the grand piano in the corner. It sat there silent as ever, mostly ignored. 1 second, then two. Emily stood still as if time had paused. All eyes began turning toward her. The tray in her hand trembled slightly. This wasn't a friendly request. It was a public challenge. "Come on," Victor added. "Don't disappoint me. I'd think someone with your potential wouldn't shy away from a little audience." This wasn't just an invitation, it was a trap. Because if she said no, she'd seem like someone too timid to stand up for herself. And if she said yes, the entire room would be waiting to judge. She could hear the whispers, feel the stares, even catch her manager's watchful gaze from across the room. Everyone was waiting to see what she'd do. At that moment, beneath glittering chandeliers and interrupted laughter, in a silence heavy with tension, Emily stood between two choices: walk away like every other night, leaving the disrespect behind, or turn, sit at the piano, and answer not with words but with music. Emily was never afraid of a stage. As a child, she played at local church services during Christmas, where the audience was familiar neighbors. Their applause was genuine, expectations light. She performed in high school among peers, where a missed note earned only a gentle laugh. But this stage wasn't in a church or classroom. It was La Fontaine, a five-star restaurant filled with expensive suits, evening gowns, and an audience not expecting art, but drama. Victor knew it. He didn't have to shout, didn't have to command. He only needed to time his invitation just right and let everything unfold. Some of his friends smiled, intrigued. One raised a wine glass, as if preparing for some light entertainment before dessert. Nearby tables turned their heads. Some exchanged looks. No one said it aloud, but the atmosphere had shifted, from a relaxed dinner to a psychological duel between the waitress and the wealthy man. Emily looked at the piano. That corner of the room was slightly darker, no guests seated near it, but the grand piano still stood quiet, elegant, and nearly forgotten. It was a moment easy to pass by. She could have smiled it off, said she was busy, and walked away. No one could force her to play, and perhaps many would have understood. But she knew if she walked away now, the next time she looked at that piano, it wouldn't be a refuge. It would be a reminder that she had turned away from herself. Subtle humiliation hurts more than outright insults. Victor didn't yell at her. He simply planted a public doubt that she was just a regular person dreaming too big. And if you've ever quietly chased something, painting, writing, baking, or just being your true self, you'll understand. Nothing stings more than someone's glance when they don't believe you're good enough. Emily took a deep breath. She set the tray down beside the bar and walked toward the piano. Her footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor, a sound barely noticeable on other nights, yet tonight it carried weight. No one laughed. No one spoke. Only eyes followed her, and anticipation hung in the air, uncertain if it stemmed from goodwill or mere curiosity. She sat down, adjusted her simple black dress, and gently placed her hands on the keys. Her palms were slightly damp. Her heart beat faster than usual, but her back remained straight and her gaze fixed on the keyboard where she felt safer than anywhere else. A server approached the grand piano at La Fontaine, not to dust it, not to entertain a regular guest, but to respond to a challenge in the only language she truly knew: music. Quietly, Emily placed her fingers on the keys. La Fontaine's grand piano, pristine as always, had rarely been played. Kept polished, admired, but seldom touched, it had become more of an expensive ornament than a living instrument. Yet now it was her companion, her only way through the invisible judgment surrounding her. The room held its breath. Victor leaned back in his chair, the glint of victory in his eye as though he'd orchestrated a private show. Others watched in silence, some curious, some skeptical, some ready to cringe on her behalf. But Emily didn't look at anyone. She closed her eyes, lowered her head slightly, not to hide but to listen inward. And then the first note rang out. Not loud, not flashy, just a soft melody, light as a breeze, gentle as a memory. Emily had chosen Claire de Lune, a piece she had played countless times in her small room by the dim golden light with wind rustling at the window. That piece was not about skill. It was a language, a diary of her heart. And as her fingers glided across the keys, something remarkable happened. The fear dissolved. Not completely disappeared, but melted into the music. Every note, every chord released a piece of worry, like speaking a burden aloud and feeling its weight lift. Emily no longer heard the clinking of silverware or the murmur of voices. She no longer felt Victor's gaze or anyone's. She forgot where she was. There remained only the piano, her hands in memory. Each change in tempo told a piece of her life. At times, it was a summer night with a fan humming by the bed and her mother coughing softly in the hallway. At others, it was a weekday noon hiding from the world just to play the old piano. Sometimes it was the gray afternoon when she received her scholarship rejection letter, sobbing at the kitchen table, playing only to soothe herself. Music to Emily was never about proving anything. It was how she survived. When the outside world refused to validate her, music was her own quiet affirmation. There is still something beautiful inside me. An elderly guest nearby placed a hand gently on her chest as the song swelled toward its climax. A young couple stopped mid-argument, their eyes meeting again, drawn into the space Emily had created. And far off, where Victor sat, there was absolute silence. For the first time that evening, he no longer dominated the room. He was just another listener like everyone else. There are kinds of power that come from money, status, reputation, but there's also a quiet kind of power that comes from sincerity. No need to assert, no need to compete, just existing truthfully. And when the final note rang out, soft as breath, the room remained silent. Emily didn't bow. She didn't rush to stand. She let her hands rest relaxed on the keys, eyes still closed for one more moment, as if to seal the memory within her. As the last note dissolved into the air, the room stayed frozen. No applause, no clinking glasses, no whispers. Only silence. But not the silence of awkwardness nor indifference. It was that rare kind of silence, the kind that follows something that truly touched you. You know that feeling, don't you? When a song, a page from a book, a painting suddenly makes you remember yourself. No one tells you to feel, but you fall still anyway. Not because the art is perfect, but because it's honest. And we're not used to that. That night in a restaurant used to curated conversations, controlled laughter, and calculated compliments. Emily's unexpected honesty washed over everyone like a wave of stillness. No warning, no permission, but everyone felt it. A woman by the window dabbed away tears, A man in an expensive suit bowed his head, lips tight, holding back something. Even those who had laughed when Victor invited Emily to play now looked down, unable to meet her eyes. And Victor, the man who had stirred it all, was no longer the center. He still sat there, wineglass in hand, but something in his gaze had shifted. He clapped 3 times slowly alone, as if by habit, without conviction. But no one looked at him, because now all eyes belonged to Emily. No longer the vulnerable server, but a true artist. No introduction, no spotlight, just someone brave enough to show up as herself. There are small moments that change an entire room, not because others become better, but because they're forced to see themselves differently when faced with someone who hides nothing. A guest, perhaps the first to find his voice, stood and began to applaud. Slow, deliberate, then a second, then a third. Soon the entire restaurant joined in, not loud, not showy. It carried a human quality, as if each person thanked her, not just for the music, but for her courage. That was something Victor hadn't prepared for. He knew how to wield power, how to steer a crowd, but he had no tools to counter genuine humility, because that can't be controlled. It can't be overshadowed. And that night, for the first time in a long while, Victor wasn't the one who silenced the room. Emily had done it, not with words, not with outrage, but with truth. When you're brave enough to step into the light as your true self, you don't need to shout. The world quiets itself to listen. As the applause gradually faded, the air in the restaurant still carried an unusual weight, as if no one was quite ready to return to reality. Emily rose from the piano bench, hands still trembling slightly, but her back straight. No one spoke. No one told her to bow. But with a small nod and warm eyes, she offered her respect back to those who had just witnessed her, not as a waitress, but as an artist. Then she quietly walked back to the service station, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Victor remained at his table, but something in him had shifted. The way he held his wine glass, no longer firm. The way he looked after Emily, not with judgment, but confusion. In the mind of someone like Victor, power always came from controlling the situation, from drawing people into his game, then owning the board. But tonight the game had reversed, and he had no next move. Someone in his group leaned over and whispered, "She's really good." Victor didn't respond. Sometimes silence is the clearest sign that someone has realized they're no longer on higher ground. Emily returned to her duties, taking orders as usual. A few guests offered her quiet compliments. One placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said, "Thank you for reminding us that passion still exists in this world." Not out of pity. They had truly been moved. Later, when it was time to bring the check, Emily approached Victor's table with the same calm professionalism. She expected nothing, no apology, no recognition. She was simply doing her job as she had on every night before. Victor looked up. Their eyes met for a brief moment. He opened his mouth, perhaps to make an excuse, maybe to offer some hollow praise, but instead he simply exhaled and wrote down a generous tip on the bill. "You're very talented," he said. His voice was neither high nor low, but it lacked the confidence he usually carried. "I didn't see that before." Emily smiled. Not smug, not cold, just a smile from someone who knew her worth and no longer needed anyone to validate it. "It's okay," she replied. "Not everyone sees it right away. Power doesn't always come from taking the stage. Sometimes it's in not letting anyone take it away from you, even if they think you don't deserve one." When Victor left the restaurant, he was no longer leading the group. They weren't laughing loudly or ordering another bottle of wine. They walked out in silence, not because they'd lost a game, but because they had just learned a lesson money couldn't buy. You don't have to force yourself to win against someone. You only have to not let them shrink you, because sometimes the calm, steady, honest version of yourself is the strongest answer. That night, after wiping down the counters and checking the tables one last time, Emily stepped out of the back door of La Fontaine. The evening air was cooler than usual. The city still glowed with scattered yellow lights, cars sweeping along the roads, but to her, everything felt quieter. She didn't walk home like a server who had finished a shift. She walked like someone who had just rediscovered something she hadn't dared to believe was still inside her, a part of herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from her manager, simple but sincere. "You did something incredible tonight. Thank you for reminding us that music doesn't need a big stage." But what made Emily stop in her tracks wasn't the message. It was the call that came right after from an unknown number. A man's voice, calm but sure, introduced himself as a music producer from Nashville. Turns out he had been at La Fontaine that evening, dining with friends. He didn't promise $1 million contract. He didn't talk about fame, but he said something that made Emily's throat tighten. I heard someone playing not to impress. I heard someone playing because she couldn't not play. And I want to help you capture that. Sometimes doors don't open with trumpets or fireworks. Sometimes it's just a phone call, a quiet offer, a stranger believing in you right when you've just learned to believe in yourself. Emily said yes, not because she thought this would instantly change her life, but because she knew she was ready to walk through that door wherever it might lead. She started setting aside time after each shift to practice more seriously. A portion of the tip from that night was enough to book a few advanced lessons she'd always put off. She didn't quit her job, at least not yet, but she did everything with a different mindset. No longer someone quietly enduring, but someone rebuilding her dream one brick at a time. An old friend, after hearing what happened, messaged her, "You're so lucky. You got discovered in one moment." She read it and smiled. Because people often only see the moment, not the journey that led to it. The years of practicing in silence, the exhausting shifts, the times she sat at her piano just to keep the fire from dying out. None of that was luck. That was preparation. Pivotal moments don't just happen. They come to those who are ready. And sometimes all you need to do is keep your dream alive long enough to be there when opportunity knocks. Sunday morning, soft sunlight filtered through the small apartment window, casting warm light over the old piano against the wall. The wood bore scratches, a few yellowed keys, and a fine crack along one edge, each a trace of time. But to Emily, it remained the most beautiful thing in her home. She sat down at the bench, her fingers gliding gently over the keys like greeting an old friend. No one was around, no audience, no applause. Just her, the birds outside the balcony, and a piece of music still unfinished. She began to play, not by the book, not perfectly. The sound rose gentle but full of life. Not to impress, not to prove anything. She played because this was the one thing that made her feel real. There was one lesson Emily had taken from everything that had happened. Fame may come and go. Opportunities may be fleeting. But the voice inside you, that feeling of, "This is me," if you dare to keep it, nurture it, and believe in it, no one can ever take that away. She thought back to that night at La Fontaine, to the way every eye turned to her, to the way her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. And then the moment the music began and the room went silent, not because it had been defeated, but because it had been moved. That moment didn't just change how others saw her, it changed how she saw herself. She was no longer someone who wanted to be a musician. She was a musician. Whether performing in a concert hall or playing alone in her tiny apartment, it no longer mattered. What mattered was this. She had found her voice again, and this time she would never let it go. A week later, Emily arrived at a small recording studio in Nashville, invited to lay down her first track. No stage lights, no director, no crowd, just a mic, a piano, and her. She sat down, nodded to the engineer, and then she began to play. That piece might never top the charts, but if someone truly listens, really listens, they'll feel what the entire room at La Fontaine felt that night. It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real, and it will silence the world. Success is not when the world finally knows your name. Success is when you no longer doubt your own. And if you've ever had a dream sitting dusty in a corner, an unfinished song, a half-written idea, a class you keep putting off because it feels out of reach, remember this: you don't need a stage to begin. You just need a moment of belief in your own voice. Emily found that voice again in a noisy restaurant under skeptical eyes, even when no one really believed in her. And what about you? Are you ready to sit down, place your hands on your piano, and let your dreams speak? If you've ever felt small in this noisy world, if you've ever hidden a part of your passion just because you were afraid others wouldn't understand, then Emily's story isn't just about music. It's a reminder that you don't need anyone's permission to chase what makes you feel true to yourself. Maybe your piano is that story you've been meaning to write, or the camera you put away, or the class you keep putting off. So today, right now, Take one small step toward it. Have you ever given up on something because you thought you weren't good enough? Share your story in the comments. You never know, someone out there might be waiting to hear your voice. And if you saw a part of yourself in this story, leave a like, follow the channel, and don't miss the next story that might inspire you. Because maybe your story will be the one that makes the world fall silent to listen.